Dr. Gambrell, thank you for being here. Would you mind sharing something about your literacy journey?
Well, I guess I was a reading teacher from a very early age. My mother tells me that I taught school, and my brother was my star pupil, and the kids in the neighborhood, they were my class, and I used to even drive the school bus, which was a little red wagon that I would pull around with kids, and I would take them to school. So from very early on, I sort of had this inclination that I wanted to be a teacher. As I grew older and got in high school, I sort of fell in love with psychology, and I decided I would major in psychology when I went to college. Then I decided that I wanted to go into advertising because I had a little job on the side. I worked at a Sears Roebuck store in their advertising department. But the longer I worked in the advertising department, the more I decided, teaching really seems to be what my heart is telling me to do. So I majored in secondary education psychology for a while, and then I switched after having a field component class at the University of Maryland where we went out into the public schools. And I remember that we visited for a week, 1 day a week, in kindergarten and then first, and we went all the way up through 6th grade. And I really fell in love with the elementary school children. I said, this is what I want to do. So I was very fortunate. I got a job teaching 3rd grade in the school where I did my student teaching. And I got promoted to 5th grade the next year. And after that, I had started my master's program and completed it, and I got hired as a reading specialist. And so I really love the fact that I'm doing something that I feel is incredibly important and worthwhile. And it's wonderful to feel that way about the job that you do every day. I love working with in-service teachers, and particularly pre-service teachers, and I love to read. When people ask me, what do you do for exercise? I say, I read. And, what is your hobby? Well, I read. I just love reading and sharing good books.
Could you tell us something that you're currently working on?
I've always been interested in the role of motivation in literacy learning. And I really think that motivation and achievement sort of go hand in hand in many respects. And the way I think about it, they're both equally important, and you sort of need both. I think that we can teach our hearts out, teaching kids all of the things they need to know, the phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary. We can just do an incredibly good job of teaching in those areas. But if a student's not motivated to read, they're not going to choose to read. And we know that the more you read, the better reader you become. And so even though you might be a fairly good reader, if you're not choosing to read, you're not going to grow. And so I love the idea of exploring with teachers, what is it that we do that really motivates children to want to read. And so I've been involved in doing research on motivation most of my career. And right now I'm involved in a very interesting project. We developed an assessment tool for assessing young children's motivation to read. And it's for kindergarten through 2nd grade. The children actually do not have to know how to read, but they do fill out this motivation survey. All they have to know are the numbers 1, 2, 3, and they have to be able to recognize some animals. And we read it to them, and then they circle their preference. How do you feel when somebody gives you a book for a present? And it has a happy face and a frowny face and one in between. So we've developed some strategies, and we've gotten really incredibly good reliability and validity on the instrument. So we've spent several years developing this instrument and piloting it and collecting data to make sure it was reliable and valid. And after we completed that stage, I've worked with researchers in 3 other countries, Chile, Finland, and Greece. We translated the items for young children, and we gave the instrument to hundreds of children in each country. And what our data seems to suggest is that there are very familiar patterns across all of these countries. And what we find is that from kindergarten to 1st grade, motivation increases. And we think it's because children are beginning to feel empowered, they're learning to read. But what happens is from kindergarten, the beginning of the school year to the end of the school year, it goes up, but it declines over the summer. It's just like what Dick Allington finds with his summer reading loss. You know, proficiency goes up and then over the summer it goes down. Well, the same thing appears to be happening with motivation, because what happens is at kindergarten, the children start here and they go up, they increase during the school year, and then over the summer there's a little decline. Well, at first grade, they start off about where they were during the summer, but then there's an incredible boost. And we think in first grade, that's when they're really developing some proficiency, and they're saying, oh boy, I can read. And then at the end of first grade, we get that drop off again. And then in second grade, it starts off about where it left off, but it sort of evens out. And that's where I think children really become aware of their own proficiency, whether they're really, getting this whole reading thing or whether they're beginning to experience difficulty. So we see some interesting patterns that are common across all children, across the 4 countries, and they're not necessarily age-related, they're school-related. Because in the U.S., children start school at 6 or start kindergarten at 5, but in Finland, they start a year later. And so we found the same pattern in Finland, even though the children were a year younger. So that makes us think it's what's happening in school that's really influencing all of this development of motivation and proficiency. So we've really had great fun working across the 4 countries, looking at the commonalities. There are some differences in terms of the items that are most highly rated across the country. And the 4 countries, and so we're getting ready to publish some of that data and present it at conferences. And so I've really loved doing an international study with friends that I've met primarily through the International Reading Association.
What is that one burning topic that keeps you awake at night? Something that we need to reconsider or be looking at in the world of literacy?
Well, now that I think about it, I think that's a fairly easy question, because I think what everybody is thinking about and what everybody's talking about in education today is the Common Core State Standards. I think it's keeping many of us awake, thinking about how we're going to address good instruction, provide good instruction for our students, and be in keeping with the standards. But I think there are other larger issues that do keep me awake. I've long wondered why we didn't have some kind of national assessment, not because I'm crazy about assessment. I think we do far too much assessment. But it seems that we could come up with one standard assessment that could be used across the country, because we spend so much of our time comparing states. And that's just such a waste, because we're comparing apples and oranges, because states have great latitude in what assessments they use. And so it's almost fruitless to make those comparisons. So I think ultimately it is a good, even though if you were wanting people to be in an instructional camp or an assessment camp, I'm definitely in the instructional camp. But I do think assessment is just extremely important, and it takes both. Instruction needs to be informed by assessment, and it's an ongoing process. But not all of the assessments that we do really inform instruction. And if you're going to have a high-stakes assessment where you are able to do some comparison, it would make sense to me to move in that direction, and then to eliminate as much of the unnecessary assessment as possible. And there is a new study out that I read just a couple of days ago by the American Institute for Research, and the title of the report is International Benchmarking, State and National Education Performance Standards. And what they attempt to do in this report is they looked at state standards, state by state, and then they had, for validity, they compared those standards to scores on assessments, and they tried to identify which states had very demanding standards and which states had very lax standards, and those that were in between. And I think both Kentucky and South Carolina were in the intermediate range. not exceedingly difficult, not exceedingly lax. And if my memory serves me correctly, Kentucky was a little bit ahead of South Carolina on that regard. But they also then extrapolated data and looked at performance on the PISA assessment, for example. And what they tried to do was to estimate the percentage of students who would pass at the proficient level. And in South Carolina, I remember, it was just under 50%. And so given our standards, we can expect 50% of our students to fail proficiency assessments. And it gives the percentage. Now, I haven't read the report thoroughly. It's not an easy report to deal with. But I've got that on my desk right now, and I'm trying to deal with that because I think what they're trying the message they're trying to give, what they're trying to say, is that we probably do need to think more carefully about what we do in terms of assessing standards. And so I think that keeps me awake at night. I think we do far too much assessing that doesn't inform instruction. And in the end, we don't have very much. Now, the exception, of course, is the PISA and the Pearls. I think they're highly regarded and do give us some benchmarks. So I would encourage people to take a look at this report, and it'll probably keep them awake at night as well.